Okay, we are recording. So I will begin. I have a little introduction for you.
Oh, I'm impressed.
All right. So I'm Jerry Delonte. I'm the new director here. Nice to meet everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. So tonight, Hackettstown Free Public Library is excited to present a very special program, a reading, book signing, and Q&A with local author Eric J. Matluck. So Eric grew up in Brooklyn and has lived in Hackettstown for the past 30 years. He holds a degree in journalism from Rider University in Lawrenceville and has been a medical editor for the past 40 years. Since 1994, he's written 11 short stories and 4 novels. His third novel, Notes for a Eulogy, was published by Next Exit Press in 2020, and his most recent novel, The Judges, was just released. So with that, Eric, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to say hello to everybody. This is the first time I've ever done this, so if I start tripping over my words, please forgive me. This is not well rehearsed, but what I'm going to do is give a little description of the book. I'm then going to read 2 excerpts from it, and then I'll open the floor to questions. That's for everybody here and for people who are on the Zoom. And then when we're done, I will sign any books that you might have, or if you don't have but would like to buy one, I have a box here that I can sell you and sign. So what the story is about, it's called The Judges. It's about a young woman who is a concert pianist. She is Indian on her father's side and Chinese on her mother's side, though she looks Chinese. At the beginning of the novel, she wins a prestigious piano competition, and the prizes are awarded by 3 judges. A few days later, when she is at home, she walks through her living room only to find 3 different judges sitting on her couch, and they explain that they are now going to judge her not on her performance in the competition, but on virtually everything else she does for the rest of her life. And what happens in the book is it highlights what Mary does that she is judged on, and contrasts what happens when the judges rule favorably and what happens when the judges rule unfavorably. Mary is a very opinionated person, as we learn, but she virtually never shares her opinions with other people. She remains very much a person apart from the world around her. And this apartness and her love of music are what makes her happy. And in fact, in one scene, she is asked by somebody how it feels to get a standing ovation by 2,000 people. And she says that applause is wonderful, but it can also be very nullifying. And when the person asks her how she means that, she says simply, sometimes I'm convinced I'd rather be sad because of what I'm thinking than happy because of what 2,000 other people are thinking. So I'm going to read you 2 excerpts. The book is divided into 3 parts, and the first excerpt comes from the first part. It's very early in the novel, and Mary is at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia, where the awards are being given in the piano competition. One interesting point to keep in mind is that the previous year, there was no first prize awarded. There were only 2 second prizes because the judges felt that the performers who did best didn't really do as well as they might have. And this, unfortunately, is something that happens more often than you might realize in music competitions. Okay, so this is what we read. When the judges walked onto the stage, like three swollen doors that would no longer fit their frames, then smiled too brightly to show that this was their moment. To hell with whoever won or lost. Mary stopped thinking about herself and started thinking about them. Their names were Nicholas Merceau, Elgin Hilliard, and Arnold Drews, not a woman among them. And if their gait and appearance suggested social awkwardness, and isn't pride always tied to awkwardness, one had to consider what they were doing and what they had done. They'd made a decision that they then had to sell to the audience. This wasn't a popularity contest where the audience was polled to see who they liked best. So if the name of the first prize winner received less applause than the names of the second and third prize winners, they might have thought their decisions were wrong, which could have been especially damaging to their reputations given what happened the previous year. Such is the life of a judge. Ladies and gentlemen, said Nicholas, first standing too close to the microphone on the lectern, then too far away where he remained. This was perhaps the hardest decision we've ever had to make. Bullshit, Mary thought. No decision is ever difficult. What's difficult is rationalizing it, especially when you have to rationalize it to someone else. And whose benefit is that line for? The winner is going to think he or she didn't really win by that much, and the loser is going to kick himself or herself for having come so close, but not quite making it. Losing by a single point is as ridiculous and cruel as being told by a doctor that he could have saved you had you seen him yesterday. But without any further ado, Nicholas said, had he been talking while Mary's mind was wandering? She wasn't sure. We're going to announce the names of the three top winners. First, third prize, then second prize, then first prize. Mary swallowed so hard that the saliva wouldn't go down her throat, and she had to restrain herself from coughing. Coughing, she'd been told by her harmony professor at the Curtis Institute, was the sound any performer dreads most, to which Mary had replied, next to a piano that's out of tune and the nearest exit door being opened. The third prize, which includes a bronze medal, a cash award of $20,000, U.S. concert engagements and career management for the year subsequent to the announcement and presentation of this award, and a recording on the Double Eights label, goes to Leonard Cohen. Leonard, tall, thin, pale, and with dark brown hair so heavily slicked back that it looked as though the top of his head had been dipped in wax, rose, smiled, waved to the audience, and stepped onto the stage to receive his medal and certificate. Mary smiled too, not to be supportive, not because she didn't hear her name mentioned, though both of those were true, but because she was thinking about Vladimir Horowitz's quote, "There are three kinds of pianists: Jewish pianists, gay pianists, and bad pianists." She wasn't sure how she felt about that, whether it was meant as a slight and a jibe, or whether it showed how far minority representation had infiltrated the public consciousness, but she still thought it was funny. The second prize winner this year, Nicholas said, and yes, this year we have only one, and there was not even muted laughter, which must have disappointed him. And again, he enumerated what the award entailed, which was everything that was included with the third prize, plus an additional $10,000 and another year of concert engagements, is Miller Bruce. Nicholas announced his name more quickly and comfortably than he'd announced Leonard's. There was no need for the gravitas and formality surrounding the mention of the third prize winner, the first name announced, or the first prize winner, the last name announced. The second prize winner is always the middle child. Miller, with his wide, flat face, pancake-like, as Mary would recall, and boxer's nose, walked up onto the stage and shook the judge's hands. Mary thought about his name. Perhaps his parents decided that, already having a last name that could have been a first name, they should give him a first name that could also be a last name to create a sense of balance, however awkward it might sound. On the other hand, They might have feared he would be ostracized for having two first names. Maybe his father had been ostracized for that. And Mary wondered if eventually Miller would become a judge because others had judged him on his name. And finally, said Nicholas, this year's first prize. And suddenly Mary didn't like the words this year's because they implied transience. Next year, there would be somebody different, possibly better to receive that award, which includes a gold medal, a cash award of $50,000, international concert tours and career management for the 3 years subsequent to the announcement and presentation of this prize. And to Mary, the judge's voice sounded like a record repeating itself, not entirely inappropriate under the circumstances. And a recording on the 88's label goes to, and Mary was sure she couldn't feel her heart beating anymore, Mary Sarabi, whose parents are dead. She was surprised to hear herself say that, but that was the first thing that came to her mind when she heard her name announced and then recognized it as her own. Not because she wished they were there to share her happiness, she was too stunned to feel happy, but because the announcement made her feel exactly the way the doctors' and nurses' announcements had when she'd lost her father and mother. She'd been sitting in a hospital waiting room both times. When her father died, a doctor came out, and 4 years later, when her mother died, a nurse came out, and each said the same thing. This year's first prize goes to, no. I'm sorry, Miss Sarabi, your father, mother is gone. And she felt a sense of collapse that ran quickly from her scalp down to her toes, but it wasn't the collapse she'd expected. It was a collapse into relief and then serenity because, in a sense, she was free. When you live in grave anticipation of a moment for long enough, you forget that you can ever feel differently. But then the moment comes, and because it's real, you accept it in a way you couldn't when it was only a fear or a hope, because there was nothing to grab onto then, nothing absolute to embrace. So again, she realized that you can't prepare yourself for anything because you never know how you're going to react until it happens. Tears welled in her eyes, and what sounded like a roaring in her head turned out to be applause, and such applause as she'd never heard, at least not directed toward her. Seemingly, she'd forgotten that she needed to step onto the stage and even hoped she wouldn't attract too much attention by doing so, but then reminded herself that everyone was applauding her. Say something, Mary, someone shouted. But when she walked up to the judges, shook each of their hands, hugged them as tightly as she could, received her certificate, and then bowed her head so that Arnold could place the gold medal around her neck, she smiled and said, I'm going to leave it at thank you, and walked away. One of the truly great moments in her life that she knew she wasn't ready for because she couldn't have been, and that she would appreciate only as time wore on, and possibly, though she hoped not, that she could look back to someday and say about it, I was famous once. The other excerpt that I'm going to read, which is a little shorter, comes from part 2, and this is where Mary first meets the judges who are sitting in her house. Two things that I just want to emphasize before I read this so you can understand it a little bit better. Mary's only career is as a concert pianist. She doesn't have a 9-to-5 job. And her father, who was very wealthy, left her, but not her brother, who appears later in the book, extremely well off. Mary has 3 friends, Lila, who is Chinese, Lizzie, who is Irish, and Julietta, who is Korean. And this excerpt takes place on a Thursday night, which is 5 days after her win. And 2 nights earlier, she had gone out to dinner with her friends, Lila, Lizzie, and Julietta. And so we read this. Then Thursday came. Thursday was her favorite day of the week. When she was in school, she always thought of Friday as the real beginning of the weekend. To her, the weekend started late in the afternoon when class let out, but even the hours leading up to it felt weekend-ish, which made Thursday the last day of the school week, or later for her friends and father, the work week, so the appropriate time to celebrate. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mary walked into the living room to play some Brahms, a composer she hadn't listened to or played lately. She loved his late piano music, terse, concentrated, small pieces that were full of emotion, mostly melancholy and nostalgia, as was usual with Brahms. Though her favorite among those pieces, and the one she was going to play, was the Intermezzo in C major, opus 119, number 3, seemingly but not quite happy work, and his next to last piece for solo piano. When she played it once for Lila laughed and said it reminded her of the Beatles song Maxwell's Silver Hammer. And when Mary listened to that song, she smiled and thought, yes, she could hear the connection. But walking into the living room that afternoon, she felt a presence, something she'd never felt before. The living alone, she thought, sensitivity to it. Still, no one had ever hidden anywhere in her house, so she looked around before even getting the piano and breathed out a sigh because she saw nobody. Hesitantly, she walked over to the bench, placed the score she was carrying on the music rack, and sat down. Then she knew someone was looking at her. And when she turned around, her senses went dead because sitting on her couch were 3 identical figures frozen as statues. From their skin and hair, they looked like 3 elderly white men. Each was tall, at least 6.5 feet in height, dressed in a dark blue serge suit, white cotton shirt, and light gray silk necktie, and each sat stock still with his palms turned down on his thighs. The creases in one figure's pants matched the creases in the pants of the other figures exactly. Their navy socks fit snugly against their calves, and each wore a pair of black wingtips that were flawlessly polished. Only they had no faces. Which is to say, where their faces should have been were deep black chasms in which Mary could see snow falling as though she were staring into a snow globe, but the snow was landing on nothing and was occasionally buffeted by what seemed like strong winds. Then she broke into clear, pealing laughter. "Bravo," she yelled. Of course, the figures didn't move because they couldn't. They were mannequins. What took her so long to realize that? Lizzie must have brought them there to scare her. And it didn't even occur to Mary to ask how Lizzie could have found or created figures that were so real and then deliver them to Mary's house without her knowing it, because Mary hadn't left her house since seeing Lizzie 2 nights earlier. Why did she think Lizzie would have done that rather than Lila or Julietta? Ashamed, she realized it was because Lizzie was white, and the skin of the mannequins, whose ears, necks, and hands she could see, was also white. Surely Lila or Julietta would have brought over figures whose skin was closer to the color of hers and theirs. But maybe she thought she was just criticizing Lizzie for being different. She continued to stare at the figures, wondering what mechanism was used to generate the illusion of falling snow. And then her fascination, at least until then, outweighed her fear. Then the first figure, the one who sat the farthest to Mary's left, raised his right hand, and Mary's vision went black, like a blink that lasted too long. When she was able to see again, she heard the first figure say, "We're quite real, Mary," as though he'd been reading her mind. "But I didn't," she said. "See us?" he asked. "Of course not. You won't see us from behind," the first figure said. "Only face to face." At which the third figure laughed, because they had no faces. Mary felt paper thin the way she would feel when she ran a high fever. What am I looking at? Who are you and who let you in? We are the judges, the first judge said, and we're here to judge you. As for who let us in, you did. She might have just stepped into the elevator on the lowest floor of a building and felt it drop. The third judge said brightly, we could have worn masks, but we didn't want to scare you. And Mary forced a laugh. No, bodies without faces are much less frightening. You know what we mean, the second judge said, shaking his head and placing his hands comfortably on either side of him to show he was sympathetic. You might have thought we were here to rob you. Mary swallowed loudly. Are you? And what do I need judges for? She asked. To win, the first judge said, leaning forward. You can't win unless you're judged. Then the second judge quickly waved his hands in front of him. But don't misunderstand us. We're not here to ensure you win any more competitions. You're not Faust and we aren't the devil. The first judge said, as we explained already, we're here to judge you. On what, Mary asked. The three judges looked at each other. Then the first judge said, on everything. Here. I am opening the floor up to questions.
What made you choose a piano player for your main character? Do you have a background in any music or anything as well?
I don't play an instrument, but I've been listening to classical music for a little over 50 years now. Originally, I was going to make the protagonist a baker because it was a baking competition that actually inspired the whole story. And then I realized I know absolutely nothing about baking. And then it occurred to me, oh my God, I could make her a pianist because I know a lot about music. So why don't I do that? And that was my aha moment. And from that point on, the book basically wrote itself. So that was how that happened.
How did the judges inspire you? Seeing the baking, you said baking competition.
Oh, okay. I'm not somebody who watches a lot of television. In fact, I watch so little television that I have only one channel on my set, and that's the Food Network. I just love cooking shows. And a long time ago, about 15 years, I was watching a baking competition. It was a weekly show, and I watched it every week. And each round of the competition, somebody would be eliminated. And then the last round, there would be 3 bakers left, who 3 judges would then assign 3rd place, 2nd place, and 1st place. And this one particular night, as soon as that was over, I had this great idea for a short story that I was going to call The Judges. And in it, this woman wins a baking competition, comes home a few days later, walks through her living room, sees 3 men, they still had faces in those days, sitting on her couch. And they announced that they're going to now judge her on everything she does. And that was going to be the end of it. So it's like this Twilight Zone sort of twist. And then it sat in my mind for 15 years. And after I had written everything else that I was on my bucket list, and this was all that was left, I thought to myself, maybe I should expand this and let her do things that the judges can actually judge her on. And that's how the whole book came to be.
A question from the Zoom.
Sure.
Debbie G asks, what made you decide the 2 nationalities? Now, I don't know if this is a question of why a biracial person or why those 2 nationalities. So do with it with you will, what you will.
That's a great question. They were both meant as nods to particular people who have been very influential in my life. And one interesting little, I guess you could call it an inside joke that absolutely nobody in the world is going to pick up on. at the beginning of the story, Mary is staying at the St. Martin de Porres Hotel in Philadelphia. It's imaginary, it doesn't really exist. And I named it that because St. Martin de Porres is the patron saint of women of mixed ethnicity.
Oh.
So there are a lot of little inside jokes that writers love to throw in to feel really superior to everybody else. So just in case people don't like it, it's like, ha ha ha, at least we have that to fall back on.
Debbie says, thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So obviously you were a medical editor. Have you always like dabbled in fiction on the side, or like what really like sparked the
Yeah,
fiction bug for you?
What sparked the bug was when I was a very small child, I loved the appearance of books, which is to say, I liked what books looked like, but I never read. I thought reading was just like really dull, but I just loved the look of books. And I decided when I was like maybe 5 or 6, I've got to write a book someday. I knew nothing about reading because I knew nothing about reading, but yeah, I liked the way they looked. So it's like, let me put a book together. So I started like, dabbling. I would take some sheets of typewriter paper, for those of us who are old enough to remember what typewriters were. And I would sit at my kitchen table and just start writing whatever came to my mind, no idea about really anything. It just, whatever was there. And then a few days later, I'd think, oh, okay, I'm bored, I'll move on. And then like a year or 2 later, I'd start something else. And that lasted till I was maybe 11 or so. And then I started writing more seriously when I was in my mid-30s.
Okay. I have another question from the Zoom. David asks, when do you write? Is it mornings, late at night, all day here and there?
That's well, let's see. Okay, I have a job, so I obviously don't do it between 9 and 5.
Gotcha.
Mostly I would see, I can't, it's a tough question to answer. I would do it only when the inspiration moves me, which is to say, I'll be doing something that's not related to the book, and then a phrase will come into mind, or a statement will come into mind, or a quote will come into mind, and I'll run to the computer. Well, I'm not running to the computer, I'm always in front of the computer. I'll sit at the computer, it's like, close out whatever I'm working on, write down the phrase, and then it's like, oh, yeah, it's morphing into something else, and like half an hour will go, well, there goes my lunch hour, and so then after work, I have a quick supper, and then do it more writing at night. There are nights when I would literally get up in the middle of the night with an idea that I just have to put down because I'm terrified that I'm going to forget it, even though I have a really good memory. And weekends, I would spend a lot of time.
Okay.
So you've written a few books, right? I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, excellent. I'm happy to have you here.
But do you give yourself like a time limit, like a time frame, like you want to accomplish like your novels by, or do you not, are you scared to rush it because like it's almost like art?
That's a really great question. I don't. I always write things faster than I expected. The actual writing of this terrifyingly took me all of 6 weeks. I expected it was going to take maybe 2 years. Well, that didn't happen. I know there are a lot of writers who will say, okay, I'm going to get up at 10 o'clock, write for 2 hours, break, and then write for another 4 hours. And I don't quite understand how somebody could do that, because I find that if I'm not really inspired, everything I'm writing is just writing for the sake of writing, and I know I'm not going to use it, and I don't feel as though it's giving me any ideas that aren't going to come to me in a better form some other time. And it's not like, it's practice, so it's good. It's like, it's not practice, so it's good. It's just something I could be, spending my time doing elsewise. So I try not to put too much pressure on myself. That's actually one of the few places in my life that I try not to put pressure on myself.
Mm,
But
awesome.
yeah, it's just that, when an idea comes to me, I'll like play with it. And I'm always surprised that I'll think, okay, I have one good sentence, and then I'll sit. I'm like, all these other good sentences are coming. I have no idea where they come from. It's like they're already there, and I'm just discovering them. I've always believed that writing is more an active discovery than an active creation. It's like it's already been written, and I'm just, looking at it and blowing or, brushing dust away. And it's like, oh, there's a phrase. Oh, there's a sentence. Oh, there's a paragraph. Let me write that down. So it's like it already exists before I even get to it.
Well, another question from the Zoom. Michael asks, as someone who has difficulty writing metaphors, how do you come up with the similes metaphors throughout the narration? He was particularly taken with the elevator one toward the end.
This is a very interesting question because I actually tend to think my writing is very low on similes and metaphors. And I think that is a result of my years as, I'm not going to say as a newspaper reporter. I was never a newspaper reporter. I used to work for my college newspaper, and I used to report for them. It wasn't professional newspaper reporting, but that sort of background gets you used to describing things in a very factual way, more than using simile and metaphor. My issue with simile and metaphor, well, my basic issue with simile and metaphor is I usually can't come up with any that really satisfy me. So when I do, it's like, okay, I'm going to grab onto this and not let it go. But I think sometimes simile and metaphor become so self-serving. It's like it becomes a fancy way of describing something that doesn't need to be described in a fancy way. And I don't know that it's as direct and as communicative. But to answer Michael's question more directly, where did I come up with that? It was actually in an elevator in an office building in New York, where I was in the lobby. There was no basement, and I pressed the button to go up, and the door closed, and absolutely nothing happened. And I must have stood there for like 5 minutes before I just opened again onto the lobby. And it's like, okay, I've got to write about this at some point. So that's my answer.
Like, wow, we have another question here from Phil. Can you talk about how you made the decision to go with the third person for the narrative point of view? It seems like you could have very easily gone with the first person, but third person allows a kind of distance between Mary and the reader that seems very appropriate. Did you always know you were going to write in third person?
This is actually the first thing I've ever written in third person. I've always been a first person writer. Because I find writing in the first person much easier. You're basically sitting down and talking to someone. It's like, I am doing this, I am doing that. Third person, as Phil said, you do have to distance yourself. But what I actually did in this book was something a little bit unusual. The book is actually written in the first person by a narrator who we never know the identity of. The narrator knows Mary, but we have no idea who this narrator is. The narrator might be Mary talking about herself in the third person. The narrator might be one of the judges. The narrator might be one of the characters in the book, or the narrator might be somebody else. And I'm saying that not because I'm trying to sound clever. I'm saying that because I absolutely have no idea. If I knew, I wouldn't be able to carry it off. If I knew, it would sound very, too artificial. And this way I just, put my blinders on and said, okay, I'm making up this nameless narrator, and he's going to tell the story of Mary Sarabi. Also, I think if I made it a first-person narrative, it would get maybe a little bit too, this is always a dangerous term to use, sentimental / emotional, because I wanted to, because what's happening to her is happening in such a kind of faceless, no pun intended, faceless way, that I thought a third person narrative would mirror that, and the first person narrative would make it maybe a little bit too familiar. So I wanted to emphasize that kind of that feeling of distance and that feeling of strangeness in the story.
How does the type of writing that you do as a medical editor complement the fiction that you write?
That's a very interesting question. I would say when you're writing as a medical editor, in addition, now let me back up. When you're editing, the most important thing that you're trying to do is make whatever is being told as straightforward and easy to comprehend as possible, because doctors, even more than the rest of us, have limited attention spans because they've got so much happening at one time. So I think by doing this, I tend even more to look at making things as objectively clear as I can, but also pay very close attention to little details, so that in the book, something that happens in one scene will probably happen again in another scene, just in a different way. So there's a lot of points of contact, for lack of a better term, between scenes. And I think that is probably something that I picked up as a medical editor.
Just a funny side note, I was actually terrified to text you yesterday because I get my yours mixed up, like my yours, and I was like figuring out a way to like go around that any way possible to say we're coming to your, event, and I was just like,
Oh my God. Yeah, I've got to tell you, people do this all the time, and it's something that I'm so used to, and I unlike some people, I never pass judgment. So no, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. I try to be as unintimidating as I possibly can.
Question.
Sure.
Do you like to read now? You said you didn't like to read
Yeah.
when you were young. You liked books.
Let me tell you how I developed an interest in reading. And I was in my 20s, and I got, for somebody who's written 4 books, I am now almost proud to say my final grade in my high school senior English class was D -, only because my teacher couldn't bring himself to stop me from graduating. And it was basically because I never read. I mean, we had novels. It's like, ooh, books. Like, and we were supposed to read them and discuss them in class. And I'd kind of like, or sit in the back row, or that sort of thing. And of course, he'd always call on me because I was making it so painfully obvious that obviously I hadn't read the book. And I would extemporize, and I became really good at that because I had to become really good at it, because it's like, I have no idea what the story is about. But I listened to what other people would say and kind of like, put things together. And from time to time, he would think, oh, maybe he did read it, but no, probably not. And then I was in college and I started as a chemistry major, and then I switched majors to journalism. And in my first news writing course at the end of the semester, it was my spring semester, my professor said, I'm going to give you an assignment. And of course, everybody's looking at everybody else. It's like, he has to be kidding. I mean, my professor was kidding about most of the things that he did that year. So that was, no surprise. He says, I'd like everybody to read 5 novels over the summer. And I knew nobody, including myself, was going to read anything, but I always liked feeling different. So I said to myself, you know something? I'm going to read 5 novels this summer. And I did. And as soon as I started reading, it's like, oh my God, what have I been missing all this time? And that's how I became a reader. And I continue it to this day, and it's really a lot of fun. And it's helped me tremendously in being a writer, because it helps you see the cogs in other literature. One of the problems, of course, in being an editor is that every time you read a book, you pick up typos, you pick up, spaces where there's a comma is not followed by a space, it's followed by another word, and these things make me want to pull my hair out, or write to the publisher and say, hello, it's like, do you want to hire me? It's really it's kind of neat to read a novel as an editor, because or even read a novel as a writer, because you start to look at it in a slightly different way, and it's fun. It also makes me, sometimes I will read a book and think, oh, this is on the bestseller list, I can do better. And but it's the people I mean, let's be honest, it's become, though, a very enjoyable pastime.
As a follow-up, Debbie asks, what do you like to read?
That's a good question. I like to, these days, I only read fiction. When I was growing up, I never read fiction, but I did read a lot of nonfiction, which made me, as a friend of mine once said, a font of useless knowledge, because I would just, pick up these facts that, unless you're on Jeopardy, nobody is really going to care about. And don't necessarily have a bearing on like real life or what passes for such. And so I switched over, from reading nothing but nonfiction to reading nothing but fiction. When it comes to fiction, because I started so late in life, I read primarily classics. I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction, but I do read some.
What are your favorites? Your favorite classics?
Favorite classics. Okay, my all-time favorite book is An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser. It's very big. It's over 800 pages, and Dreiser was a notoriously bad stylist, but I found it extraordinary and very, 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 very deeply moving. And my a second favorite classic is the Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which is a story about a young man in Germany during the First World War who spends 6 months, actually goes to spend a few months and ends up spending years in a tuberculosis sanatorium, and the people he meets are representative of people from other countries in the world and how World War I came to be, and it's staggeringly fascinating and mind-bending and wonderful. And yeah, I read things like that and I just think, but you know, still, it's nice to have what to hold in esteem. And you know, if I could do that, then it would lose some of its magic. So you know, it's fine that I can't do it.
Do you like writing?
No. Do I like writing?
Sounds like this
I do. Sometimes it's difficult because it requires a lot of looking into myself, and sometimes I see a lot of things I would really much rather turn a blind eye toward. And aside from that, yeah, it is fun. It's like when I can come up with a phrase that I really like, or a character who really convinces me, or a situation that I think is something unusual, then it's a great feeling. But you know, it has its pluses and minuses, but many more pluses, I would say.
Is this a lucrative business?
Not at all. Oh my God, no. I mean, no.
What do you really think?
That was the famous story about fiction being lucrative is Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The writer, and I do not remember his name, allegedly submitted his book to 175 different publishers back in the day when there were 175 different publishers, and each one simply rejected it out of hand and said, this is never going to amount to anything. And he ended up selling, I don't know what it was, 15, 20, 25 million copies, and became richer than God. And that's about the only time that writing ever becomes lucrative. Outside of that, no. It's not really something that I would recommend doing for the money.
Mm.
Do you have any favorite characters in the book?
That's a good question. Actually, my favorite, Mary is my favorite character who I ever created, but I love Mary's father. She was actually based on somebody I used to work for, and he was just a very kind man. And sometimes when I was creating him, I thought to myself, you know, you don't often meet really kind people, and it's really something special when you do. And so I would say he was probably my favorite character.
Would you have any advice for someone who wants to start writing?
Yes, the most important thing, I think, when you're writing is to write to please yourself. Don't try to please somebody else. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, somebody else isn't like this monolithic, everybody else likes this. So if you write that way, you're going to please everybody. If you have, 500 people who really like what you did, they're going to like it for 500 utterly different reasons. And if you can satisfy all of them, that's wonderful. But more often than not, there are going to be people who do like it and people who don't like it, and people who like it more and people who like it less. But if you satisfy yourself, then it's like, okay, you've really pleased somebody, probably more than even your most ardent critic is going to enjoy it, because you know how much went into it, and you know what your strong suits are, what your less strong suits are, you know what hurdles you've overcome. So if you can satisfy yourself by knowing that, then I think you really, really accomplished something.
When you start writing your books, do you find the story changes much, or do you have it all outlined at the beginning?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I outline. Okay, when I start outlining, think of bacteria splitting themselves and then, reproducing and just like becoming more and more and more and more. So I'll start with a vague outline and then it becomes more detailed and more detailed and more detailed. By the time I am done outlining, the writing is just basically connecting the dots. But a lot of times at the beginning, especially at the beginning of a book, even with the most detailed outline, characters will go their own way and not be at all who I thought they were going to be, and not do things at all that I thought they were going to do, and say things that honestly surprised me. I just basically sit back and listen to them. Again, I think it's more an act of listening to your characters and seeing how they develop rather than straitjacketing them.
Is the outlining included in the 6 weeks?
No,
Okay.
no. It took me maybe 3.5 months to like get the ideas together. And then think of how the book, I mean, I had this basic idea about the book that Mary was going to, meet the judges. And then I had to think, all right, what is she going to go through? And what are the specific things on which she's going to be judged? And that was probably the hardest thing for me to work through. And then how do the judges respond favorably? What happens when they decide to judge her positively, and what happens when they decide to judge her negatively?
I feel like I've always had a picture painted when it comes to writers and their hair is all crazy and their outfits are.
I have apples.
And they're, and then, like, but you just always look like well pressed, well put together, like when you're home or.
Oh, that's
like,
because I'm not writing. I'm not writing. I'm in my pajamas and my hair is like all askew and I'm like, I have my, my mouth is like parted, thusly. And but actually no, I'm just kind of like an OCD person, so it's like I'm always like this, but it's controlled chaos.
Second question,
Oh, I have a question.
Sure.
So, I know you probably come up with a lot of ideas. How many of those are like left on the cutting room floor as opposed to things that actually come to fruition?
More than I would like to admit. A lot of times I will come up with an idea, and sometimes I will write a passage and think, oh, this is really good. But then in the great context of things, it doesn't quite fit. And I'll say, but I really want to keep it in. And I'll keep it in, and then I'll read it. And it's like, no, this really, it's fine, but maybe put it somewhere else. It's just not going to fit in this. And so with rewriting, it's always a matter of eliminating. And there was one particular scene in the book that I basically ended up cutting in half by just removing paragraph after paragraph after paragraph when I could see it's slowing it down. And when I get up to the end and then I read everything from beginning to end, I like there to be a particular pace that continues throughout the book. And that's when you really start to feel, oh, okay, I've come across something that is just not gonna fit.
I just want to say thank you. I enjoyed the presentation very much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for coming.
Hope you sell a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Debbie's applauding.
Thumbs up, Debbie.
Do you have any other questions?
Ever write comedy?
That's tough.
No.
It's tough.
Yeah.
I've always believed that comedy is much harder to write than
Yeah.
tragedies,
Oh, yeah.
and I think it's probably because people in general are less familiar with comedy. I think most people would say that their lives are more tragic than comic. So tragedy is something you can just, yeah, well, I've been through this, I could write about it. Whereas comedy is like, ooh, that's a little bit hard. So I try to throw some comic elements into the book to relieve the seriousness of it. But actual comedy, I leave to far greater minds than mine.
Did you have a hard time getting a publisher?
I actually published this myself.
Self-published, yeah, I have a friend in town who was an author who did that too.
What happened was with my previous novel, I went to, there's a site called Readsy, which is marvelous. It gives you lists of literary agents, lists of designers. And I came up with a list of maybe 130 literary agents and started writing letters and just emailed them. Most of the time they would say include the first 10 pages of your book. Sometimes they would say just give a description. And invariably, they would write back and say, we're sorry, we're not interested. And every time that happened, what I would do is, after feeling really sorry for myself, I would say, wait a minute. I would sit down, I would reread the entire book because I was familiar with the book, so it didn't take that long. I would reread, it'd take me maybe 2 days, reread the entire book from beginning to end, say to myself, is there anything about this I would change? And then I would say, no, okay, it's their problem, not mine, and just move on. And eventually, after enough time of doing this, I decided this isn't getting me anywhere. So I think I'll just do the self-publishing route. And that actually turned out to be quite good. But I also have to say that I hired a publicist who is outstanding, and that did help a lot in getting me, I mean, even getting me here is all thanks to him. And this is something honestly never would have crossed my mind. So it was great.
Gotta have good PR, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And PR is not something that I'm especially gifted at.
I had one more question.
Sure.
Have you ever experienced the dreaded writer's block?
Interestingly, no. Thank God. I mean, I know what it is like to sit in front of a computer and stare at a blank screen and think, oh my God, this has to be filled up with like 75,000 words, and I don't even have one, and that is extremely daunting. But I think that's also because I only write when I feel the inspiration. I think if I had to force myself to write something, I would probably experience it pretty often. I think, It's like, okay, today I'm gonna write 10 pages, like. But I don't feel like writing 10 pages, and I'd just be sitting there, it's like, yeah, nothing's coming, and I mean, I could make something up. But it would seem inauthentic to me.
Yeah, I think some authors have deadlines and whatnot, so that must
They
be,
do,
that must be
yes.
hard, yeah.
Yes, and that's one of the nice things about not being a professional writer,
Yeah.
is that you don't have that sort of pressure on you. Because when you have that sort of pressure, I think, it's possible that you're kind of maybe compromising because you're writing too quickly, or you're trying to you're trying to satisfy somebody else rather than satisfy yourself. And it's like, well, okay, so-and-so is gonna really like this, and it ends up so-and-so doesn't like it, and you don't really like it because it wasn't coming from, deep down. So, yeah, that's one thing that makes me glad that I don't do this, professionally.
Anyone else? No other questions? All right. Did you have anything else you wanted to read, or did you just want to get to selling and signing? It's up to you. However you want to run this.
I will read one more passage, which, not to give too much away, is probably my favorite passage from the entire book. And this comes toward the end. This is from part 5 of the 6 parts. And Mary has been accosted by a stranger because she's Chinese, and he made a disgusting reference to her quote unquote broken eyes. And she's back at home. She was out with her friends when this happened. She's back at home. And I should also mention, as we find throughout the course of the novel, Mary is a very self-critical person, and she believes that this self-criticism helps her being a successful pianist. And so she's laying on her bed, and this is what we read. And this also helps to explain the title of the book. But she couldn't get him out of her mind. One thing that scared her so much was his use of the word broken. Not because she didn't want to think of herself or any part of her as broken, but because she'd never heard it used that way. She thought that all prejudiced, bigoted people were stupid, misinformed, and unenlightened. They didn't know how to express themselves. Well, that was what she got for not exposing herself more openly to prejudice, or just learning how to ignore it. Cleverness, if you could call it that, was never a quality she'd attributed to them. But clever people, rather than stupid people, were ultimately more dangerous because they could think of more effective ways to cause trouble. Maybe it wasn't ignorance people should be afraid of. Maybe it was cunning. And then she thought she might have, and then she thought he might have been right. Maybe she was broken. Yes, agreeing with someone for the sake of agreement was always the easiest way of ending an argument, and she knew she was arguing with herself. But if he hadn't told her something that was true, she could have walked away unbothered, right? The things that made her happy weren't the things that made most people happy, so why should they make her happy? Maybe being happy was the wrong thing to do. Maybe being happy was the wrong way to feel. She sipped her juice. The fact is this: more people hated the things that the nameless man hated than loved the things that she loved. She turned over on her side and looked at the lamp on her nightstand, simple and plain. She never minded being depressed or hurt if she could learn from it. Then something occurred to her. She'd spent her entire life tearing herself up in the exact same way the nameless man had. She knew that. Nobody ever asked her, why are you so different? Nobody ever said, you should like the things we like. Only Mary said that to herself. And if you asked her why, as I once did, she would say, I guess it's to inoculate myself against other people's disapproval or what I perceive as other people's disapproval. If I could hurt myself enough by telling myself enough terrible things, other people's slings and arrows wouldn't bother me. I'd be numb. But that, she would then admit, was a horrible, though unfortunately common way to go through life. And those thoughts never took hold for very long. Was she broken? Was she wrong? As long as she thought she was standing in judgment of herself, just the way the nameless man had, and that made her no better than him. Then she raised her head from the pillow, took a long swallow of tomato juice, and realized what she'd done. And oh my God, she thought, we're all judges.
Your vodka in that tomato juice. You know, you got your most profound thinking done.
So.
Said juice, I thought, oh, I would have had thought wine. And then when you said tomato juice, I said, oh, there's gotta be vodka.
I love Bloody Marys too. And the fact that her name is Mary has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with that. It's completely just fortuitous. It was not planned. But
Thank you.
I just had a quick question. Do you ever
Sure.
put like a thinly veiled version of yourself in any of these books? Like you self-insertion anywhere or anything like that?
yeah, I would say that I do put myself probably in each of my characters to a greater or lesser
Right.
extent, which is not to say, and I have to make this painfully obvious, not to say that the nasty things that the nasty people in the book believe are in any way endorsed by me, but I've heard other people say them. And when people say prejudicial things and because they're feeling threatened or because they're feeling angry, I have been through situations in my life where I've been threatened and I've felt threatened and I've been angry. And so I just kind of put this in, so kind of build from what I know and then put a different object there so that I can make it more easy for me to comprehend.
Well, John Carlos says, wow, about the passage that you read.
Oh,
So,
tell her thank you.
well, you just did. So there you go.
Thank you.
All right. So anybody else have any other questions or? No? All right. That's up to you. What you'd like to do now, if you want to.
If anybody wants to buy a copy, I can sell it to you. They're on sale here for $20, which is less than what they're charging on Amazon. I have no idea why they're charging what they're charging. I put a price and that's not the price I put. So I don't know. I mean, if anybody is making a profit on it, it's not me. It's got to be Amazon. So.
All right. So if the Zoom has any other questions, please send them now. Otherwise, I'm going to be turning the Zoom off. Oh, Jamie says he's in the middle of reading it, or maybe she, I'm not sure, in the middle of reading it and are enjoying it very much.
Excellent. Excellent.
She.
Yes.
There you go.
Jamie is a she. Yes.
Steven says, thank you. All right. Well, thanks for attending virtually. Oh, hang on. Phil has a question. Are there any types of characters you haven't had a chance to write yet?
Oh, wow. That's a very, that's a mind scratcher. Wow. Huh. Well, thank you for asking, Phil. Let me. Jeez. I'm gonna actually have to think about that. I'm sure there are. Oh, wow. I am always worst possible thing for a writer, at a loss for words. I mean, nobody wants to open a book full of blank pages. I'm sure there are. Yeah. Let me sleep on this one. But kudos to Phil for a really, really good question. It's a really good question. And Phil, when you come out with your next novel, I will ask you the same thing.
Says you're welcome. Debbie says, another great book. Thank you for sharing your talents.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for being there.
All right, so I'm gonna turn off the Zoom now. So thanks, everybody.